Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of Bible Wars. Before we continue with our series on the Assyrian Conquest of the Northern Kingdom, I wanted to do a bonus video discussing the Baalist culture of the Northern Kingdom and how Baal worship impacted the economy and livelihood of all those living in Israel. Hello, I'm Knight Jake and welcome to Bible Wars. There are two prophets that deal directly with the Northern Kingdom, Hosea and Amos. According to these two prophets, there are 4 reasons why God had given Israel into the hands of the Assyrians. 1. The people of Israel have trusted in foreign powers, such as Egypt and Assyria, instead of the Lord their God. 2. They had devoted themselves to the worship of the golden calves in Dan and in Bethel. 3. They had devoted themselves to the Baal Asherah worship. And 4, because of prostitution and other sexual sins. It is these last 2 that I particularly want to focus on in this bonus video, as they actually go hand in hand and play a key feature in Israel's socio-economic structure at this time. Throughout the book of Hosea, God gives numerous judgments regarding the lack of childbearing and the lack of produce in the land. Hosea 9:11 states that Ephraim, which is the name he gives to the Northern Kingdom, as Ephraim was the main tribe in the Northern Kingdom, that they will have no birth, no pregnancy, and no conception. This is a judgment on absolute sterility. Verses 12 and 13 go on and mention that even the children that have already been born will be murdered. Verse 14 also mentions the women having dry breasts and miscarrying wombs. And verse 16 adds that Ephraim's root will dry up and bear no fruit, that they will bear no children, and that the beloved children of the womb will be killed. And in verse 15, God promises that Israel will be utterly cut off. Hosea 13:15-16 mentions that the Northern Kingdom is fruitful, but that destruction will come, and that the infants will be dashed to pieces, and that the pregnant women will be ripped open. This prophecy is fulfilled in 2 Kings 15:16 when Menahem usurped the throne for Shallum and ripped open all the pregnant women. God also mentions in Hosea 4:3 that the land will mourn and that the animals will all be taken away. This brings to mind Romans 8:19-23, which mentions all of creation groaning because of the sin of man and eagerly awaiting the restoration of man when creation too will be restored. Hosea chapters 8-10 mention Israel being without produce. 8:7 mentions that the Israelites will sow wind and reap whirlwind. This is to say that they will sow nothingness, and that they will reap only chaos and suffering. The stalk is said to have no bud and produce no meal. If it were to produce anything, foreigners would swallow it up. In chapter 9, God promises that the threshing floor and winepress shall not feed them, and that the new wine shall fail Israel. And in Hosea 4:10, it says that they shall eat but not have enough. In Hosea 5:12, God says that he will be a moth to Ephraim and a dry rock to Judah. In Matthew 6:19, God warns us to store up treasures in heaven, not on earth where moths and rust will destroy. God promises Israel that he will be the moth to them that will destroy their earthly treasures. Now what is the significance of God's judgment to make the people of Israel and the land of Israel so infertile? The answer is due to the nature of Baal worship. See, God is the provider of Israel's wealth, produce, and population. In Hosea 2:8, God declares that I gave her grain, new wine and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they have prepared for Baal. God also mentions in 2:9 that the wool and linen were from him. God has given Israel her produce, but instead Israel has given that produce to Baal. In Hosea 10:1, it is mentioned that Israel empties his vines and brings forth fruit for himself, and that according to the multitude of his fruit, the number of altars increased. This is meaning that Israel has stripped away their produce to build and worship the idols of Baal. In Hosea 8:13, God does mention sacrifices made to him. However, this sacrifice the priest has eaten, as God states, "For the sacrifices of my offering, They sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept it. Instead of giving the animal flesh to God through burning sacrifices, the priests have been eating it, and they have displeased God. This was a common practice of the Baal priest, to offer food to Baal and then to eat it themselves. A theme of Hosea is prostitution. Israel is guilty of committing prostitution with the false gods Baal. This is both metaphorical, in the sense that Israel is the bride of God and that idolatry is spiritual adultery, and this is also literal in the sense that the Israelites have offered sacrifices with temple prostitutes. Hosea 4:14 also mentions that the Israelites have been committing adultery. The women have cheated on their husbands by becoming prostitutes, and the men have cheated on their wives by sleeping with these prostitutes. This is all to do with the idea of how Baal worship operated and how it impacted the socio-economic structure of Israel. Baal was the sky god of fertility, both of childbearing and of crops. His wife, Asherah, was the earth god who produced the crops. Baalists believed that the rain was Baal and Asherah coming together as husband and wife, and that their union would produce crops. The practice of temple prostitution was twofold. 1. Union with a prostitute meant union with a god. If a person slept with a female prostitute, then they were sleeping with Asherah. Also, Deuteronomy and the books of Kings mention that there were also male prostitutes. If you slept with a male prostitute, this meant you were sleeping with Baal himself. In addition to this, the Israelite women were not allowed to sleep with male prostitutes. They could become female temple prostitutes, but they were not permitted to sleep with a male temple prostitute. Oh no, only men could attend the shrines. This meant that the only people allowed to sleep with the male prostitutes were other males. Thus, the male prostitutes of Baal were homosexuals. The second purpose of the temple prostitutes were to excite Baal. Baalists believed that storms, particularly the rain, was due to Baal and Asherah sleeping together. Thus, no rain meant that Baal and his wife weren't sleeping together, and thus a drought meant that they had been apart for quite some time. Thus, the job of the temple prostitutes were to arouse Baal and to encourage him to sleep with his wife. The Israelite Baalists credited Baal and this system of prostitution with their fertility, both in childbearing and in crop-bearing. Thus, God's punishment to make both the Israelites and their land barren was how God demonstrated his power over creation. He was the opener and closer of the womb, and all produce came from God, not from Baal. So the Israelites had two choices. Heed the words of Hosea and repent to God and acknowledge him as the Lord of all creation, or they could continue to give the credit to Baal and continue in this system of Baal worship and temple prostitution, desperately trying to produce more children and crops. Israel was committing mass prostitution through the Baal worship system of temple prostitution. The women were cheating on their husbands and becoming prostitutes, and young unmarried women were entering into this system. However, God declared that he would not punish the women, but the men. He declared that he would not punish the women of Israel for prostitution, nor the wives for adultery, because it was the men who went after the prostitutes, and it was the men who offered sacrifices via the temple prostitutes. The men of Israel, as the heads of their households, were responsible for their family and their nation as a whole, and thus they were responsible for the sins of Israel. Not only did these men seek out the prostitutes, thus creating a system of supply and demand, but the men failed to raise godly, chaste women. At this point in time, Israel was a Baalist nation that functioned on this system of temple prostitution. To keep this system running, the nation needed more prostitutes, and thus the women of Israel were raised thinking that prostitution served their family, their nation, and their God. The men were thus responsible for both the supply and the demand of Israel's system of temple prostitution. It is not surprising that God compares the Israelites' sin to Adam's transgression. Despite the fact that it was Eve who was deceived and not Adam, Adam is still the one given the blame for the fall of humanity. This is because Adam was given the command not to eat from the tree, and Adam stood next to Eve while Satan tempted her, and he did nothing. God explicitly rebukes Adam for listening to his wife and eating of the tree. Adam failed to listen to God and failed to take charge of his family. Thus, he is the one to blame. In regards to Israel, God gave specific guidelines in the Ten Commandments not to worship false gods or graven images, and not to commit adultery. The men of Israel failed to heed God's commandments and failed to take charge of their family and nation as responsible heads. Thus, the men and not the women were ultimately responsible for the sins of Israel. This is the Baalist economy of Israel. Baal and Asherah give children and crops. Rain comes from their union. If there is no rain, then Baal needs to be aroused. Thus, the nation of Israel needs prostitutes to arouse Baal. Thus, if a woman becomes a prostitute, she serves her God and in turn provides her nation with rain. For the northern kingdom, prostitution was seen as a noble profession, upon which all the social economic structure sat. If prostitution stopped in the nation, it was believed that Baal would not get aroused, and thus he wouldn't sleep with his wife, and thus there'd be no rain. The entire nation was being held up by this nationwide system of prostitution. The ironic part is that it is this system that the Israelites put their trust in that failed them. It was this system that led to their punishment. Because the people had followed false gods and foreign nations and had indulged in a life of sexual immorality, God brought the nation of Assyria to conquer the northern kingdom. I hope you've enjoyed this bonus episode of Bible Wars, and I hope you can join us again next time as we continue our series on the Assyrian Conquest. Goodbye and God bless.